I will find the secrets of duck sauce. Whether it's good on chicken, duck, turkey, or it's a super soldier syrup. I'll let you know in a few weeks. I've thought often about, when I've covered taking exams in college. We've recently talked about, when I was getting ready for a big music history exam, and I happened to catch an interview with Tiger Woods about them asking if he was anxious, and he says, if I didn't care, I wouldn't be anxious, right? A little bit of that performance anxiety. And then the next day he wins the green jacket, and that was big. That was a big moment. Not just obviously for him, but for me to look at performance anxiety for things like tests, right? And in music school, you literally are performing for a lot of your tests. The barrier juries, the saxophone piano exams. And when you get to music theory, there's two parts of music theory. There's the written theory, but then there's also the like timing music theory, where you have to recite, you sing notes, you have to write down the notation you hear. That was big. Ear training, ear notation, part of music theory. Those were some of the hardest exams I ever took, but I'm grateful for them because the thing about exams is that there has to be something to evaluate performance. There's so many students at so many schools, and so being able to have some type of examination to threshold that, I do think is important. And as much as I'm all for auditing a class, I've done it myself for a bit. The thing is, when you audit, there is really nothing on the line aside from a little bit of time and tuition, but there's no exam that will be coming up in a few weeks, which could naturally change how attentive you are in the material, in the course. It's like playing poker without chips. You could go all in and try to look crazy, but because there's nothing on the line, it can alter the way people play. And so with examinations, because there is that natural performance anxiety because you care, their next step is just like playing in the PGA Tour. What are the things you can do to prepare for, good execution? And something that's kind of been brought up, whether I was at Metropolitan Community College, MU, or UCM, is good test-taking skills. And it's really interesting because, again, college covers so many different things. When you get an associate's degree, you go through, you take biology, mathematics, history, and English all over again, just like in grade school. And, there's a lot of electives. And basically all those classes had an exam. Even the classes that didn't have exams, like I took fitness and wellness, there still was a form of evaluation. You logged your hours and you had to do a form of either like a diet analysis or some type of, final project based on what you did over that semester to stay fit and healthy. And again, it's helpful for the schools to have some form of, it's basically skill evaluation. And so, what's interesting is no matter the subject that I took, there really were universal test-taking skills that you could develop and hone. And it was your fundamentals. It was your bread and butter that you could always take with you. Because whether I was learning about Beethoven or I was, learning about, bees making honey, being able to understand this is the concentrated material right now. What should I focus on? What's my scope? And how can I execute these answers was big. And I think the big picture is obviously, again, because there's something on the line, it naturally gets more students to care about the material. And I think good teachers want to actually educate you, right? I think some people think that, school is just a bunch of tests and we're just a bunch of numbers on the board. Well, the numbers are there because, unfortunately, there are people that get really complacent and they might not care much, and then they that needs to be weeded out in terms of like a evaluation of performance. Now there's all these different discussions about how stressful school can be for people, how it can affect someone's like mental state, stamina, endurance. Me personally, I I loved the pressure. I was borderline addicted to challenge, and there was some pretty challenging stuff. But it's I definitely think there's a constant push or shove. There can be some pretty unreasonable teachers that might not care as much about their students, and they might actually purposely make tests hard. And then there's really good teachers that just happen to cover subjects that are tough, right? They talk about dental school, medical school, music school, with theory. And I appreciate the teachers that are able to take pretty difficult topics and find the best ways to execute in educating students to understand the material. And shout outs to the teachers that go above and beyond to really get to create their own test that covers the material, but in a way that can still have students not over stress about it, but obviously prove some form of competency. So when it comes to test taking skills, my good friend Trevor Atkins and Isaac Bartley, they growing up, they were the ones that I knew that were really good test takers. I know Isaac Isaac, from what I gathered, did basically all his work. Yeah, he did for sure. I just know he told me that he'd much rather do tests than like papers in general. And for what it looked like, he killed it on his tests. But Trevor in high school and in college, and he would just tell me and friends like Brent this, all the time, is that he would not do homework. He would purposely not do like papers, and teachers would be like, "Trevor, don't you want the points?" And he's like, "Eh." And then he would just ace the tests over and over. And you know what? I mean, he's, what is he doing bad there? Obviously, I mean, there are times he definitely was, advocating to like, homework, just do good on the tests. My philosophy is homework helps. It helps get ready for tests in general. It's points. But you know what? Again, he wasn't cheating, which is great. And he just did well because certain classes prioritize tests the most. He pushed that, and I think there was a consistent factor of him being a good test taker, him and Isaac. And so, looking back, it's like, what makes for a good test taker? And what I would do, what I've gathered, like something that I definitely carried with me between classes was, right when an exam starts, you have about 50 minutes in a average 3-credit course, right? So the first thing I would do is if I had any big subjects in my short-term memory that I knew were not in my long-term memory by the time of the exam, I would write it at the top of my test in pencil. For example, there was a few coding classes I took for my minor in computer science. And I remember multiple times walking to the computer science building at UCM the day of the exam. And there was material I knew I had memorized, but then there was material I knew was still kind of in the short-term memory. So on the way to the center, the building, I would just repeat over and over in my head, like, this is this. Like, literally, like, a class holds these things for a program, stuff like that. And I would repeat that class holds X to do Y kind of thing over and over until I sat down, and then I wrote class XY, like something like that. And it was helpful because then, like, midway through the test, you'd see a question on it, and then bam, you already had it. Ironically, sometimes by repeating it that much, you didn't even need to write it down anymore. And then you could erase it later to help the teacher not be confused. But that was one thing I did. Another thing I would do is I would go to the end of the test. Some people joke about, test backwards. More about, I do think testing forwards is important, but there is a bit of fun risk reward with testing backwards for a bit. because sometimes when you start at the back or a few pages back, it'll give you answers to some of the first questions. It literally could be like, I took a history of rock class, and there could be a question about this musician was well known for covering a bunch of songs in the 50s, Elvis Presley, as one of the answers. And obviously that's a pretty easy question, but if you didn't know that, you could go a few pages in, and then sometimes the answer's right there. It would be talk about Hound Dog was well known with Elvis Presley, but it was originally, done by, right? And so that right there gave you the answer to your question, and you took the risk of looking a bit further ahead. Or the comedic part where you kind of pick up that other people in the class have got to that part of the test, and you hear and see erasing. Obviously, don't cheat, don't look at other people's tests, but you can kind of hear, or in the blind view, the corner of your eye, you can see the erasing marks. That stuff's funny, but that shows that, oftentimes the end part of a test could give answers early on. Another merit was that when you looked at the end of a test, it would tell you the last question number. So if I see there's 30 questions in 50 minutes time, my brain is already being okay, I got about a minute and 20 seconds per question. That might be a little too lenient because I'm going to have to maybe erase and turn pages. So I'm going to give myself a minute and 15 seconds per question, right? And so that's just a good way that your brain can calculate averages. And so while I would take the test, I'd be okay, a minute, 15 seconds as my example. And if I knew questions super fast, then my brain, kind of like a video game, would do a green plus mark with added time. You're playing Cruising USA, new time bonus, and you get a bit more time for other questions. And so, that was big. With short answers, I've noticed that looking back, I think the short essays and the short answers were definitely, I think, my strongest thing I pushed for. In terms of where to put my time into an exam if I have extra time. Short answers, short essays. It's almost the reason they're at the end of the test is because if they're at the beginning, that would be brutal to a lot of new students. They might spend so much time that they don't have a lot to answer for the rest of the test. But I did notice about myself is that when it comes to short essay and paragraphs, a big part is me thinking, what does the teacher want to hear, right? This is part of test taking skills is, multiple choice is its own thing about, oh, there's no way it could be A 5 times in a row, but that's also what you think about. You're what kind of teacher is this? And you're I've had teachers that just say, oh, I randomized the Scantron. So in that case, it can be A 5 times in a row on multiple choice. But then when I'm oh, this teacher wants their students to succeed and understand the material, then I'm they're not, I don't think they're going to do A 5 times in a row because they're in control of the answers here. They're not letting a random Scantron thing do it, right? Though there is the rare case where the teacher does do that on purpose, just to really test someone, but that never happened, at least to me. And so when it comes to short answers, you really are gauging what does the teacher want to hear, rather than because that's the thing, rather than saying what's the answer, it was more about what has the teacher been wanting me to demonstrate that I've learned as a student? What form of competency have I got from this material, from this course, to show my teacher I am applying critical thinking skills to this topic? Because that's a big part of college, is honing and or developing critical thinking skills. So rather than me talking about what did Mozart do for classical music, right? Which that's a pretty open-ended question. But let's say the question is, how would you explain Mozart's influence on classical music? Someone could make a pretty low-effort answer and say, a lot, and they'd probably lose all their points there. But that's where you start thinking, when did my teacher talk about Mozart? But I think the extra answer is you make examples you learned about, and then use your brain to say, oh, these musicians were inspired by Mozart. You can hear it at this part of the song because there's similarities in their play style to how Mozart did music. One big example is in music history, we learned about the harpsichord, and the harpsichord can't sustain notes. So then your brain will correlate who in the time period could only write music on a harpsichord, basically, because there was no pianos. And then once you learn about musicians that played the piano, you could find the ample opportunity to say, oh, this classical musician on the piano does a lot of staccato. I think this correlates to how influential that harpsichord musician was to them. There you go. Yeah, it's so big about correlating patterns, using critical thinking skills, and as an exam, executing it in a decent amount of time. But that push or shove is good. Life is all about using time as your ally, moving along with it, right? Not against it, not fighting against it. There's good test taking skills, there's good studying skills. Give yourself a break for sure, but also make sure that you're staying pretty well disciplined and not just reading material, but understanding why the material is being given out at your institution. It is interesting to say and to look at, and there might be topics you don't agree with, but I think that's often a case why classes also have papers, because it can give you room to almost debate. You can be you can put yourself out there to make an argument for yourself. And the class doesn't have to be philosophy, but just like short answers in a test, I do think papers offer your kind of mental canvas and showing the teacher what you learned and your perspective, because there are times where teachers learn from their students and they'll say so. So I definitely, I'm glad I went through college, and test taking skills will help you throughout, even after college, because again, time should be your ally, and being able to perform upon a task or something for yourself in a matter of time while using your critical thinking skills is something great to carry on in your life, for sure. I love Mondays.